The New York Times reports that new tensions have emerged between the Biden administration and Israel, with two senior Israeli officials worried that the U.S.'s commitment to restoring the 2015 Iran nuclear deal will lead to a flawed agreement giving Iran the green light on its nuclear program. This comes as the administration is reportedly weighing more economic sanctions on Iran as negotiations continue to lag. As professor at Georgetown University and executive vice president at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, Dr. Trita Parsi points out, there's been hardly any coverage of this in the U.S. media, which begs the question, is the idea of Israel pushing the U.S. into war so normal it no longer counts as news? Dr. Parsi joins us now to discuss the negotiations further. Maybe it is just so normal. One thing is, obviously, during the Trump administration, if this were happening under his time in the White House, people would be freaking out. We saw this often in the media, people freaking out saying, oh, no, the tyrant is marching us into war. This happens, these Israeli foreign ministers, I believe it was the defense minister, Benny Gantz, right? And the other one, but they come here and
Mossad.
The head of the Mossad. Okay, so, you've got these two top dogs there in Israel trying to angle for war. It doesn't even make news here. Is it because the administration just brushed it off and said we're not going to go in that direction?
It's stunning. I don't have an answer as to why it's not causing news, because you're quite correct. Not only did it cause news during the Trump era, but it also did so under the Obama era. And right now in the Israeli media, there's talk about this all the time. I'm just stunned to see that there's no coverage that when the Israelis send their foreign minister and the head of the Mossad with the explicit message that talks should end and the United States should take military action. I mean, they're not even trying to mince their words here. That is actually not causing any mainstream media coverage. The only thing we saw, which was an interesting piece in the New York Times over the weekend, that talked about the increased tensions without necessarily calling out that they're actually pushing for war or pointing out that this is all indicating that the Biden administration's strategy of trying to create a united front with Israel has utterly failed in that regard. I mean, it looked decent up until the negotiations got into a decisive phase, and then it all broke down.
And Trita, meanwhile, you've had a bunch of high-level Israeli officials acknowledging on the record that it was a mistake to pull out of the Iran deal, and it was a mistake for Israel to encourage Trump to pull out of the Iran deal. So why would Israel's advice be, Israeli officials' advice be taken remotely seriously at the exact same time they're telling us, yeah, whoops, we kind of blew that one?
Exactly. I mean, you're putting your finger on it. Mindful of the fact that so many senior Israeli officials, and we're talking about people like former Prime Minister Ehud Barak, and others are coming out and saying it was a huge mistake. I think Barak's words was that it was an unforgivable mistake to push Trump to leave the Iran deal. And the fact that they're now coming back and again pushing for war, that all of this is not weaved into one major piece saying, what on earth is going on here? Why are we still taking the advice or even taking seriously recommendations from this government, mindful of the fact that it was a key element that caused us to end up in this current mess, a very, very dangerous and devastating mess that once again has put the United States on the brink of war.
There was news over the weekend that so Trump has increasingly soured on Netanyahu because he perceives that Netanyahu didn't back up his contention that he had won the election and, congratulated Joe Biden. So Trump's very bitter about that. And seeing like headlines that so Trump says Netanyahu never wanted peace with the Palestinians, and he's all grumpy and angry that that Netanyahu exerted as much influence over Trump as he did. Could that actually be a construct? Trump could possibly return to the White House. Could it be constructive for those of us who want peace rather than some kind of aggressive, more aggressive action, military action that Trump is seemingly getting kind of wary of him, but not for any kind of principled reason?
Well, first of all, I think what is quite fascinating is that it's taken Trump this long to figure this out, that yes, Netanyahu was not into making peace with the Palestinians, that the problem was not the Palestinians, but Netanyahu. And secondly, that he was stringing Trump along on the Iran question and was actually pushing Trump to go to war. Trump didn't want to go to war. But he went along with the strategy because he thought that it would actually enable him to get a better deal, whereas Netanyahu knew all along that it was actually putting him on a path towards war. Hopefully, this means that we will have a more honest conversation and recognize that while Israel is a strategic partner of the United States, its interests of the interest of at least this government and the previous government of Israel and that of the United States are widely diverging on the issue of negotiations with Iran. And Biden needs to make a decision. Does he want to pursue the U.S.'s interest of preventing Iran from having a nuclear weapon? Or does he want to defer to the Israeli interest of making sure that this conflict continues in order to ensure that the United States remains militarily committed to the Middle East? To me, the question is a no-brainer, but unfortunately, it seems to be something that is not as clear-cut.
Well, and this is why I think it's difficult to believe the reports coming out of Israel that, oh, no, we shouldn't have backed out of that deal. We shouldn't have encouraged Trump to drop the deal because, you know, it seems that they have been angling for war for a really long time and that was always the end game in backing out of that deal, knowing that the Iranians were not going to come to the table and negotiate a deal that was worse for them after the U.S. backs out of the original nuclear deal. So, you know, it seems that they've always been angling for war. They were mad at Trump for not really doing more in that more military aggression against Iran. And, you know, so now it's kind of, oh, so you guys were saying, oh, we shouldn't have pulled out of that deal. But the end game seems to be the same. I think what they're really upset about is the U.S. isn't ending up going to war with Iran yet.
Yeah, I mean, the end game from certainly during the Netanyahu years was very clear. They wanted the United States to go into military confrontation with Iran. It's not about the nuclear issue. It's about shifting the balance of power in the region, in Israel's and in Saudi Arabia and the UAE's direction, something that they cannot do on their own. They wanted the United States to use its blood and treasure to do. And again, it goes back to the question, do we actually have a definition of what our interest in the Middle East is? Or are we just deferring to our strategic partners and pursuing their interests? In my view, our interest is to not be any more endless wars in the region, in a region that is increasingly strategically marginal to U.S. national interests. And as a result, we need to put our foot down and make sure that as much as we can continue to have very good relations with many of these different states, our military is not up for rent. And us going to war has to be a question that is only settled on whether our own interest and our own security is at stake, not that of other countries who we actually don't have formal treaty alliances with.
Okay.
Yeah, and it makes me wonder also if Israel is going to end up doing more aggressions against Iran. We know that they've been doing inside sabotage against some of their warehouses, factories, power plants, and it just kind of makes me wonder if they're going to escalate in order to antagonize Iran into a war. And then what do we do? Is the United States allied with Israel at that point? Sorry, Ryan.
No, go ahead, Trita.
Absolutely, and I think what the New York Times piece reveals that is interesting is that the latest attacks that the Israelis conducted in Iran was actually done after consultations with the United States. So one of the changes that seems to be taking place now is that whereas during the last couple of months of the Trump era, the Israelis conducted attacks without consulting with the U.S., now they are. But the difference is that the real question is, are they stopping doing this, or is the United States actually giving a green light for them to do this at this point? If that's the case, then I'm really questioning as to whether this negotiation tactic will be successful if we at the same time think that we can use the Israelis to conduct attacks inside of Iran. To me, it seems to be really asking for trouble and signaling a lack of sincerity in negotiations, if that is the case.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Trita Parsi, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
And we'll have more Rising right after this.